passage, but no matter how short it is, I think probably everyone recognizes it almost instantly. It's from a Vivaldi concerto known as The Seasons, and it's one of these passages that tends to stick in people's minds for a variety of reasons. One of the things that stands out about it, of course, is the tremendous energy that's there. I'm just transcribing it myself on the piano here. It's for full orchestra with solo violin. But I think what we can pick up on certainly is a lot of the energy that's required to play something like that. However, there's something else that's going on, another form of propulsion. There's a kind of harmonic energy that's surging through that passage, and it's something that we call a sequence. A sequence is where, harmonically at least, we're talking about a type of chord progression that gets used over and over again, that gets repeated one more time, one more time, one more time. At some point it has to end, and we're going to be very interested in a certain type of sequence that defines its ending by its beginning. We're going to call it a circle progression, specifically something called a circle of fifths. Now, the idea of a sequence is something that we were already familiar with from the previous video where we were talking about a passage that's very famous as well from Pachelbel. That passage actually happens to be the accompaniment for the Pachelbel canon, and that was the progression that we used to harmonize a melodic line that was a full scale. Now in that case, what was sequential about it was the fact that we were working with two types of root progression. First, root progression by fifth, and then to go from that to the next root progression by fifth, we went up root progression by second. So by fifth, by second, by fifth, by second, by fifth. So going back and forth between root progression by fifth, by second, by fifth, by second, that's what created the harmonic underlay for Pachelbel's canon. In the case of Vivaldi, he's actually only using one type of root progression. It's root progression by fifth, and he's tracking it in a very interesting way. If you think about the accompaniment that I was playing for that, we have a basic pattern underneath all of this, which I can simplify to this. And that is identifying a series of chord roots that are root progression by fifth apart from each other. So if I actually added in the harmonies that Vivaldi is working with, I'm in the key of F minor, by the way. It's a very nice sequence of chords. You might be picking up on the fact that it's a very rich harmonic vocabulary that Vivaldi is working with. This is just a plain old vanilla F minor triad. That is subdominant harmony, but it has a seventh added to it. Then, because we're in a minor key, we use the subtonic. Rather than the leading tone is the root for chord 7, we're going to actually use the diatonic seventh. So if we're in F minor, that has to be an E flat dominant seventh chord if I turn it into a seventh. And then I move to chord 3, which is a lovely major seventh chord. And then I'm going to a 6/7 chord, which is also a lovely major seventh chord. And then I'm going to chord 2. So I'm getting a half diminished seventh, and then finally 5/7 to 1. So that is a very special type of progression involving seventh chords. I'm going to be saving that specific one for later on in this video. But the basic idea underneath all of this, the fundamental idea, is something that we call a circle of fifths progression. When we use the term circle of fifths in a harmonic context, it means something a little bit different, because rather than moving between different keys at different hours of the day, what you're actually doing is moving between chord roots within the home key. Therefore, not all the fifths are going to be perfect ones, as we'll see. Also, what we might want to keep in mind is that the important feature here is that we literally do have a circle, because if I am starting at my tonic key with that chord in root position, I happen to end up at it again through that sequence, which is not something that we get in that key signature circle of fifths. So what I want to do next is actually take us to the board one more time and look at this idea of a circle of fifths progression. How would we actually harmonize that? What would some of the basic patterns be? And then what we'll come back to eventually is the Vivaldi, because that's going to add a little further detail of significance, the use of seventh chords, and it's going to raise a topic that we talked about before in this course, where we said, what happens if I move between two chords, both of which are seventh chords and their root position is a fifth apart? We already learned something about that in just two chord sequences. We were going from 2-7 to 5-7 and progressions like that. We're going to revisit that idea and see how it plays out on a larger scale. But the first thing we need to do is take a look at a very basic sort of progression, not quite as complex as what Vivaldi is dealing with. Welcome back. So what I've drawn on the board behind me are a couple of sample circle of fifth progressions. What I want us to keep in mind is that both are working with the same fundamental unit. However, they're using that unit in different ways. Specifically, the unit we're going to be thinking about is progression 3 from much earlier in our course. That is to say, a 1-5-1 progression, although in this case, we just want to think about the 5-1 aspect of it. If I have something that is defined as a circle of fifths progression, meaning root progression by fifth all the way through, one thing I might want to do is say, okay, well, if I already know about root progression by fifth, why don't I apply that from each chord to the very next one all the way through? Why don't I be completely consistent about that? Surely that would simplify things. Well, that's exactly what's done in this particular example, which is the first one that we see on page 318 in the textbook. And what our textbook shows are the common tones that are being held that are familiar to us from progression 3. So if I play that for you so you can hear what it sounds like, I'm in the key of F major. I should make that clear. Though all other indications should make that clear, but it doesn't hurt to remind ourselves of that. Here is what it sounds like. Which certainly sounds no more near Vivaldi than Autumn Leaves, I suppose. Now, this is something that I've only traced out the common tones because that's what the textbook does. However, I've put some more information in there. First of all, I'm noting that this is really a continuous use of progression 3, the A, the B, and the C version. So just to remind ourselves, the A version is where the chord of resolution has the root in the soprano part. The B version is where it has the chord of resolution has the third, and the C version has the fifth, the root, the third, and the fifth. And so what I've done is indicated each of these things, that we're working with 3A to go from there to there. If I want to go from this chord to that chord, I use 3C. If I want to go from that chord to that chord, I have to use 3B. So I'm going back and forth between A, B, C, A, B, C, A, B, C, and so on and so forth. And again, if I were to draw out the typical voice leading that we're used to, that upward step to the chord of resolution, I can see that much more clearly. So what I'm going to do one more time is just play it from there to there, and from there to there, and from there to there, so you can hear that it's consistent use of progression 3 all the way through. I should add in this to indicate the continuity of that. And in that sense, it might seem a little bit like I was going from 5 to 1, for example, in the key of B flat, or 5 to 1 in the key of, I don't know, E flat major or something like that. What I'm trying to indicate is that we already have this idea of how 5-1 works. It's the same kind of motion that's being deployed here in the voice leading. Now, the thing is, that is being very consistent, saying all the time, I'm just going to be rigid about this and use that basic voice leading model all the way through. However, by trying to simplify it in that fashion, we've actually made it quite a bit more complicated, number one. Number two, it also doesn't really have that propulsive character that the Vivaldi had. I mean, the Vivaldi piece, even if I slowed it down, it would seem to have more of a sense of direction behind it. This one kind of seems to meander a bit. It's not really taking advantage of the possibilities of a sequence. So what's over here is essentially a redrawing of this idea. This is one is also in our textbook. But here what I'm showing is the same use of progression 3, but it's only one type, 3B, which is to say where the chord of resolution, actually I've got that wrong, it should be 3A. The chord of resolution is given with the root and the soprano. And here, if I did imagine it literally as a sequence of 5-1 progressions, I'll do that. This is the idea of secondary dominance, if you will. What I did in each of those cases is just to pretend as if I was in B flat major, as if I was in A minor, as if I was in G minor, and then to precede each of those with a secondary dominant before it. But I don't need to do that. I've got a very nice chord progression now. Where all of the chords are diatonic. They are part of the key of F major. What's different about this is what I'm identifying as a segmented progression 3, which means that rather than using progression 3 to get from one chord to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next all the time, I'm just doing it in segments. So I have progression 3 there, progression 3 there, progression 3 there, progression 3 there, and it's 3A, 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 3A. And what that means is that rather than trying to create this as sort of a seamless sequence where I'm just trying to connect everything that I possibly can, I'm letting myself kind of hop in these areas in between to create these segments. And what that means is that this progression gets a lot of its sense of momentum because it's not just one chord after another. It sounds like 2 chord units, and each of those 2 chord units has a little goal of motion in itself, from there to there, from there to there, from there to there, from there to there. And of course, when I played that using secondary dominance, that really brought that to the fore. But what that also suggests is that underneath this, there's a kind of series of target chords, which is not unlike the solfeggio that we were talking about when we were looking at secondary dominance. So you might remember for that piece, I was looking at that as though I had a tonic chord, a 6 chord, a 4 chord, and then a 5 chord, then a 6 chord, and then back to 1. Those were diatonic chords, and each of them was the target of a dominant seventh of some kind. That's a proper dominant seventh in the key of D major, and then a secondary dominant to get me to that B minor chord, and then I had a secondary dominant for the subdominant, secondary dominant for the dominant, secondary dominant for the submedian, and finally I was back again. So I had that series of targets. Here I'm not using secondary dominance at all, but I have a sense, because of this spacing that I get, where I'm not being continuous with progression 3, that these things become targets of motion. So then something else structurally comes into view, and that is to say, I hear an underlying linear descent in the chords of resolution, if I can call them that. Scale degree 4, down to scale degree 3, down to scale degree 2, down to scale degree 1. So it's rather like there's an underlying sense of subdominant harmony, mediant harmony, supertonic harmony, tonic harmony, right? 4, 3, 2, 1. If I play it just like that, it doesn't sound that great. I mean, I have all of these parallel fifths and parallel octaves and all the rest of it. But if I think about that as a composer, it suddenly makes the progression so much easier to write, because I have a sense of not just where each of these things is going, but that they themselves are forming this gradual descent, 4, 3, 2, 1, and I aim for each of those using progression 3A. And what it gives to the pattern overall is a sense of deep direction to it, and that's the kind of thing that Vivaldi is working with in the Four Seasons. So what we want to do next is take this basic model and see what the different expressions of it are, because we might find some very interesting patterns there that will help us understand music beyond Vivaldi. We're back, and what I've done is written out 3 possible versions of that progression we were just introduced to, using the same framework that we're always using, starting out with the first version having the root of the opening harmony in the soprano, then the third, then the fifth. I've put some other information in there as well. I have this idea of looking for the target chords forming a kind of linear descent. In these cases, you can see me going from one to that, from one to that, from one to that, and I'm identifying those as the targets for these little segments of progression 3. So this is the one that we first took a look at in the key of F major. Over here we have a new possibility, 6, 5, 4, 3. So a progression like this one wouldn't sound quite as conclusive at the end, because we only have an imperfect authentic cadence there. And back here, I can actually put the numbers with the first chord, because this is based on progression 3C, and therefore we have common tones in the soprano, and this one is going from scale degree 1 down to scale degree 5. So I'll play each of these in turn for you so you can hear what they sound like. And as I've already indicated, saying, oh, this is like progression 3C, what you'll see me also doing is just going to the very end of each of these progressions where I can literally see a 5-to-1 chord and get that information about which version of progression 3 is it. So this is the 3C version. We can see how we have the fifth being in the soprano for the chord of resolution, common tone approached by stepping the other parts. This is clearly progression 3A because we're arriving at the root. In the soprano, there's the common tone stepwise motion, and of course progression 3B because it's the third that's up there. So what that means is this thing that I'm identifying just from 5 going to 1 dominant going to tonic harmony, that pattern is being used for each of these segments. So once again, it's the 3C idea, break, 3C idea, break, 3C idea, break, and so on. And that's true for each of these. And what that means is that in terms of actually writing these progressions, what you can do based on the melodic descent for the target chords is you could actually put those chords in first and then write them as though they're chords of resolution in any of these progressions. So the first one that we looked at before was the 3A version. Sorry. And that was the one where I said, you know, it could be done using secondary dominants to really hear it sounding like a 5-2-1. And what that means is, in the back of my mind, I know that I'm going for, sorry, this is what I want. Sorry, it always sounds so terrible, those parallel octaves and fifths. But what I'm doing is just putting that in place for myself first, and then these things resolving to those. So if I get that 4-3-2-1, literally just writing out this chord in first inversion and in the bass line, I have my targets and I can just resolve to each of these as I move along. Over here, it's a little bit more bold. I mean, I just have the triad in root position up on top, starting with subdominant in that case, then again to median, then to chord 2, then to chord 1. And over here, of course, it's with the third on top, so the triad I'm looking at is second inversion. But in every case, the whole idea is I'm going to 4, I'm going to 3, I'm going to 2, I'm going to 1. And it's just how I'm deciding what will be the soprano part for that chord. But the harmony itself is going to be subdominant, mediant, supertonic, and then tonic. Now, if I want to turn these kinds of progressions into minor, what happens is I go for a little bit of a switch. So if I went from, how about, I could stay with B flat, but if I imagine going into, let's say, E minor, and I'll do this one. So if I were in the key of E minor, and actually I'm going to do this one. I want to put it in the middle so that you can see it as clearly as possible rather than off to the edge. But I'm actually going to do that progression. There's a particular reason for it that I shall reveal in the not too distant future. If I'm in the key of E minor, I'd be starting the pattern in the same way. Always my goals of motion are going to be 4, 3, 2, and then 1. All right. So this is how I would set myself up. Now, at this point where I would think, oh, because I'm in a minor key, I should think harmonic minor. If we're doing a sequence, remember this is the same thing for that Pachelbel progression we learned about, where we were alternating between root progression by fifth and root progression by second. We had a descending melodic line that was a perfect scale from beginning to end. It also begins and ends at the same place. We were using the keys of F major and F minor. When we did it in F minor, I don't know if you'll recall, but what we specifically did was to say we're going to hold off on the harmonic minor idea until we get to the very end of the progression. We're going to save it for this dominant chord that's going to end the progression in a very firm and clear way. And so what we applied before that was the idea of the natural minor, and that meant that we were having scale degree 7 not as a leading tone but as diatonic. So in that case, if I were to do that here, 7, because it's not the leading tone scale degree 7, it's indicated as flat 7, even if no flat is actually being used. I mean, we're dealing with sharps. I would presumably have a natural if there'd been a leading tone before that, but I don't need it because of the key signature. But nonetheless, the idea is that it's a semitone lower than what would normally be used. So flat 7 is what the indication is, and it is major in quality, okay? And then likewise, if I come to chord 6, this is something that's going to be major in quality. And at this point, when I would come to my chord 5, there I would want to restore harmonic minor. There I would want to restore the leading tone. But if I'm thinking about where I would begin, I want to set up this pattern in exactly the same way. What will I do? I'll do it up here. So this is where I would be starting things out, and then the chord that I would be resolving to would be this one. So again, where I'm going to, you know, a target chord where it's the third scale degree of that. Sorry, the third of the chord is what would be in the soprano, so the third scale degree, sixth scale degree. And so what I can do is go, right, that's chord 4. It's an A minor triad. The next thing would be a G major triad, like so. Chord 3. Chord 2 diminished would be this. And then finally I would be at chord 1, tonic harmony. So I'm ending where I began, hence the idea of a circular progression, a progression that ends where it would be, where it began. If I were to play this, those are my target chords, and what I want to be able to do is to have that same feeling of, right, common tone up by step to that. So common tone and up by step, common tone and up by step, and common tone, and very important, up by step. So that once again I would have these segments of progression 3B, right? And now, rather than just that, now that's kind of curious because I could imagine another way of doing that where I'm not just literally doing these chords like that, but maybe you might start to get a sense of why I'm doing that if you remember from earlier in the course, a piece of music that we were listening to by Robert Schumann of Foreign Lands and Peoples. We might be starting to discover where Schumann was getting his idea for a chord progression, although the way I've played it might sound a little bit Schumann-esque, but if we know the piece, it doesn't sound quite right. It's kind of like Schumann was interested in using this circle of fifths progression, but somehow he gets it wrong. And I'm sure it wasn't a mistake. Something is happening around here that Schumann is going to monkey around with, and that's something that we will be looking at more closely in the very next video when we focus on that particular piece. But just in general right now, what I want us to recognize is how we can take exactly these kinds of progressions, and here you can see them side by side, major version, minor version, and then the kinds of adjustments that you need to make to put it into minor, generally assuming diatonic minor until we come to the end of this. And for that reason, often these kinds of sequences are not understood in functional terms on a chord-by-chord basis. So often what you'll see for functional analysis is something like this being written. Yes, we are starting with tonic harmony. And then the sort of force of the sequence takes over until finally, yes, we have a clear dominant in that case and a resolution of some kind. And then some theorists will say, well, but it has a nice subdominant approach to it, so I can put that in as well. But this idea is going to be a very interesting one for the next type of circle of fifths that we look at, and that's going to be circle of fifths using seventh chords. And we need to pay attention to that because this idea seems to be something that was very much in Vivaldi's mind in the way he used his seventh chords. We'll take a look at that next. Okay, so this is the last of the basic root progression by fifth circle of fifth sequences that we're going to be looking at in this video. And the first one that I've given is the one that comes out of the textbook, and it's doing exactly what we saw before when we looked at chord 2-7 going to chord 5-7, where the third of one chord, rather than resolving straight away, turns into the seventh of the next, which then resolves. So third gets turned into seventh and then resolved. And this is an overlapping process. And you can see that here. I'll just play the progression for you. So here is my first seventh chord, and I note that the third of the chord is staying common tone with what turns into the seventh of the next chord. Here it's the seventh that resolves appropriately. So this seventh resolves, this third turns into the seventh of the next chord, and when it does, then it resolves as a seventh should. The third of 7-7 is held onto, it turns into the seventh of chord 3-7. Once it turns into that seventh, it can resolve, and in this case, the third of that chord is held on again. And this process goes on until we get to the penultimate harmony, which is the last seventh chord. That's the true dominant seventh chord. And finally, at that point, the third properly resolves. So if I were to play just the thirds and sevenths, that's a very characteristic chain of thirds and sevenths that run through these kinds of progressions. Once you've had them pointed out to you, you can always hear them straight away. So in playing that for you, I've voiced it so that the thirds and the sevenths are heard as clearly as possible. So that is a kind of textbook version of what one should be doing to make possible this chain of third and seventh exchanges that takes place. And as our textbook notices, what makes it happen in this case is the use of these incomplete seventh chords. So that is what is making that possible, all right? Right to the end. So you're alternating between a complete seventh chord, incomplete, complete, incomplete. Always when you have your incomplete, of course, you're taking away the fifth of the chord. Now that is not what Vivaldi does in the Four Seasons. What we get instead is a pattern that approximates to this. And again, I'm trying to kind of simplify things from a very full orchestral texture. So Vivaldi does something like this. Playing it down the octave just to try to remind us of what the bass actually sounds like. What I'm noticing here is a return to the idea for the circle of fifths progression that we learned before, where I perceive a sense of these kinds of units being used. So, so steps being taken. And what that means is that Vivaldi cannot be doing the nice structure that we're given in our textbook. What is actually happening here is a lot of kind of harmonic skullduggery, I would say. We do see in one line, in one segment, this transmutation of a third turning into a seventh and then resolving, and we see it there. So third turns into seventh and resolves, third turns into seventh and resolves, and then we have to get back to a proper 5-7-1 resolution. But we're not getting a chain of that in two parts. We're not getting something being a third while a seventh is resolving correctly. And that's what I'm showing here. In these steps that are being taken, that's the seventh, and in every case, it is not resolving correctly. So here I'm showing by an arrow that, you know, this thing should be going down, but Vivaldi moves it up. He moves it up. Likewise, there's a kind of quantum tunneling effect, if I could put it that way, where in this case I've got a seventh, and rather than it resolving, the third, rather than that thing turning straight away into a seventh in the same voice, it's popping down and then doing that weird resolution. So it's not the third turning into the seventh, which then properly resolves. It's the third even hopping in some sense to another part and then incorrectly resolving. And my sense of this is that Vivaldi likes the standard circle of fifths progression, and he wants to convey the character of that with these very prominent harmonic steps that are taken, but he still likes the brightness, the panache of seventh chords. So to bring these two things together, he's doing something that's quite funky in its way. And part of the idea there, I think, is that Vivaldi wants something that harmonically has a tremendous impact. So even if you take away all the vigorous instrumental performance and all the rest of it, the harmonies themselves are very bright and propulsive and create a tremendous effect. So Vivaldi is coming up with a kind of hybrid circle of fifths progression involving seventh chords all the way through. They are complete chords. He wants the full sound of the chord at each step of the way, and it's a kind of progression that's monkeying around with what should be a very basic model of root progression by fifth. The reason why I started the video with that particular passage is because the other one that we were listening to today, that was this thing that sounds kind of like it could be Schumann. Once again, isn't exactly what Schumann wrote. What we'll discover Schumann does is take something that could be a basic model, but he's going to, I'd say, distort certain features of it for a particular effect that he wants. For us to be able to understand why he's doing that, however, we're not going to be able to look at it as just a single stretch of harmony, a single stretch of chords. What we're going to need to do is take that particular passage that's in this work by Schumann and put it in the context of the work as a whole. So this is actually why, in terms of this video series, I went directly from the discussion of mediant and submediant harmonies to the circle of fifths. This is actually setting up where I want to go next, which is an analysis of Schumann's Of Foreign Lands and Peoples as a whole. And we'll discover that Schumann will want to bend the rules a bit, shall we say, with the circle of fifths progression, precisely because he wants to do something with submediant harmony in that piece. To understand the immediate progression that we'll be looking at, we're going to need to look at the larger setting for it.